Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould's new book, The Valediction, Nights of Desmond, is a novelized memoir about America's involvement in Afghanistan. Paul and Liz entered this saga as journalists and witnessed firsthand how our involvement became a neoconservative cause celebre and the CIA's largest covert operation in history, which is now undoing not only the American empire, but also the concept of empire itself.
We finally reached the point with the Afghan story where we knew that getting more facts was not going to amount to anything. We were not going to change the narrative. That was our revelation, that the narrative was controlled by something other than facts.
It's almost like you go searching for, a dark force in the universe, and you discover that, you think with your eyes and your senses, you say, oh, this is what's making that happen. And then you go and you address each one of those different things that you see happening, and the people that are making them happen, you think are making them happen. And then you discover that there's something else here.
And there may be some other quality behind the curtain. And that's where mystical imperialism comes in, which was one of the revelations that we had about trying to explain to ourselves what this process was that the leadership was in. And it has to do with the actual real power of imperialism is actually mystical. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand where this power comes from. It does come from the power of the imaginal. It does come from the power to literally, within your thoughts, begin to form ideas that eventually do become reality.
And the larger and the bigger the empire becomes, the more magical and mystical it becomes.
Right. And the more people who have been taught and are shown the images and the narrative of a desired future by people who want to manipulate the masses, the more that could get created.
Well, I think part of what we're living through is the end of an empire. And I think that's important to understand. Empires traditionally always end badly. I think that may be the lesson we're supposed to learn, that imperial thinking has its downside. It may have a big upside at the beginning, but it has a huge downside at the end, that it seems to lead to a kind of dementia. And I think that's part of what, and so what is the imperial mind doing? It's justifying the use of force. Right. And I think that has a lot to do with why we are literally trapped in endless war. What I'm giving you is actually a bit of the finale in our understanding. It really was when we entered that mystical door with Oliver Stone and discovered that the power of dreaming and the dream nature of Hollywood was real. We had actually left the realm of journalism and decided to write screenplays. We found that we needed to dig deeply into Paul's Fitzgerald family as the story. That was one of the results of this probing that went on in our own thinking and our experiences. And when we saw the film JFK, which is coming around 30 years this December, we were overwhelmed by the mystical aspects of the intelligence operatives who are being revealed in this story. And so we decided to kind of investigate, and that took Paul, of course, into his family roots as a Fitzgerald, going deep into the origins of the Fitzgerald family back to the 11th century, and then building to the Norman invasion of Ireland and all of that. We decided that we wanted to bring the idea of an esoteric motivation behind the assassination of JFK to Oliver Stone because of his film. We got in touch with him in early 1992. Well, the minute that we set up the meeting with him, I began to have dreams with him and my family. And they were very prolific and very detailed. And it was very unusual. I never met this man. I have no knowledge of him. And here he is hanging out with my mother, my father, my sisters, my cousins. And there are things going on in these dreams being revealed. And I feel like I know him. Like a family member, he's with my family and he is family in some way. So this goes on. Okay, we finally meet with him. Then Paul starts having dreams. Those for him didn't start until we met him. So the dreams actually became constant and prolific. I mean, we had dreams every night, and every night and morning we're exchanging information. And sometimes the dreams were informational, where there were things going to be coming from Oliver and things like that when we finally did sign a deal with him. But that in that original effort was to give him what we're referring to as the voice, which was the unfinished business of the Fitzgerald legacy going back to the 12th century, the 16th century, and bringing it up to date as part of the motivation. So Oliver basically said, well, I'm not interested in that, but I want your Afghanistan story. So that's what we began to work on. And so the dream aspect kept motivating us to write the voice. And as we wrote the voice, we kept giving Oliver chapters, even though he wasn't, quote, interested in it. We started giving him, like every week or so, we'd give him a new chapter.
Right. And that's the Fitzgerald story back to the 1100s. That's the voice.
Yeah. At some point, Oliver said to us, could you put some of the voice in Afghanistan? So we realized he wanted the mystical.
That evolved
Right.
into the valediction.
Yeah,
But,
exactly.
It was once again, but it was all, we had another 30 years to think about it, and a return visit to Afghanistan after the Soviets had left.
Yeah.
And the Taliban had taken it over, and we went there in 2002. We got to talk to a lot of the people who had been involved with the Mujahideen. We talked about a lot of to all the different people. We had Hamid Karzai's sister, Fazia Karzai, who ran a restaurant here in Boston. So we got into a whole different layer, and we met Seema Wali, who had been King Amanulah's, I guess she was a great granddaughter.
Yeah, we worked with her from 1998 until she died in 2017. She was the heart and soul for us of the Afghan people, the voice that wasn't.
They referred to her as the real queen of Afghanistan.
Yeah. So this was this was what kept us committed through her. Because we felt that it was at least being appreciated by the Afghan people through her. Even though we couldn't change policy, we couldn't really make things better for the people.
Right.
And that was what was so hard for her to finally have to accept, that the United States never really planned on giving you back your nation, Seema. It was never part of the plan, Seema.
We never helped them in the 80s. We didn't help them in the 90s.
And we didn't certainly help them in 2001 till 21 here.
In the late 90s, the Taliban was in complete control.
Oh, it was, and she was working at that point. The Mavis Leno and the women's movement was really on top of the fact that women were being brutalized in Afghanistan.
The only people who were doing any stories, real stories about Afghanistan, were the entertainment media. Yeah, Entertainment Tonight used to do stories on a regular basis.
Well, Mavis Leno really.
What are we wasting our time with CBS and ABC and NBC for, when the entertainment crowd are the ones who are actually doing it, doing anything. And they were doing some very good stories, and they were doing them basically about what the Taliban were doing to women, which was horrible. The United States always just never really wanted anything to do with Afghanistan. They were really, the United States was basically looked to Britain. Britain considered itself to be the authority when it came to Afghan affairs. The United States didn't even have an embassy there until World War II. Roosevelt himself sent somebody from the embassy in Tehran, I believe, to establish relations directly between Washington and Kabul, because they didn't have any. I came across the papers that our first ambassador, had written to Roosevelt directly. And so he says, I don't think Britain really wants to modernize Afghanistan or make them remotely independent at all. He was really getting a sample of what the British Empire was really all about, and how they kept control of their colonies.
Well, that was a big issue with the FDR administration, that there was a heavy influence of the British that were always challenging FDR's different opinions about how to move the world away from colonialism. And the British actually weren't interested in that.
So at the end of World War II, Afghanistan came to the United States and said, we'd love to establish a normal relationship with you. And the Dulles brothers, who were running the State Department and the CIA, said, well, we have an ally in that region of the world. It's called Pakistan. We don't really need you.
Right.
And so 1953, 1954, Mohammed Daoud, the prime minister, basically said, well, if you don't want us, we're going to turn to the Soviet Union for help, because we need help. We desperately need aid. We need modernization. We need all kinds of things. And the Soviets are quite willing to provide it. The Soviets built the roads. They, built a lot of the major
evil empire.
They brought Polytechnic. They built, they helped them build Kabul University. They built a lot of things, and the United States contributed. There's no question they did.
Usually when they felt that that they needed to compete,
it was a
kind of.
peaceful competition
Yeah,
between
it
the
was
United States and the
exactly,
Union,
yeah.
but the American contribution was minor in
Yeah.
comparison to what the
Yeah.
Soviets poured in.
So what ends up happening though, once Brzezinski targeted Afghanistan for the place he was going to, basically, destroy the Soviet Union and give it their own Vietnam, the Afghans had no idea. I'm certainly the Afghans we dealt with, okay, had absolutely no idea. I'm talking now about the ones who were on the American side, okay, what level of betrayal was coming. But they never had extremists. That was one of the things about Afghanistan. They never embraced anything of the extremism. They had the Sufi Islam, very spiritual, very mystical, moderate. And they were very open to other religions. It's well documented in the 19th century that British would come into Afghanistan and be greeted and accepted. They were not automatically rejected because they were Christians and because they were white. They were absolutely, they were known for their hospitality, world renowned for their hospitality, and still are. Okay, and so part of the challenge we've had ever since we got involved with this issue, especially amongst the Afghans that really believed the U.S. position, the Soviets did do something terrible and it was all their fault. It's been a very difficult process. In fact, that's part of our story, ties to when we were working with a number of them on the Altai project, which was an attempt to try to create a conference where we could bring and rejuvenate the Afghan people to each other, okay, both left and right. We were always trying to convince the right-wing Afghans that the left-wing Afghans that were, quote, pro-Soviet were not all evil and didn't all do evil things, that they basically just had a different viewpoint about how to solve Afghanistan's problems. And that they were more than willing to work with Afghans who came from the other, political spectrum. And, so this was late in the game at this point. This would have started about 2012, 2013, that kind of time period. And that actually leads to when we reconnected back to HARE in 2016. One of the reasons we connected back to HARE was because one of the people working with us, when he found out that Paul had worked on HARE and that we were involved in it for a year and all that. And we also had the video that we had gotten from Paul's Aunt Marge that we converted and had now. And that's how it ended up online, because they loved it. They wanted that to become a part of the conference.
This Altai conference that you definitely, you did or you planned it?
No, we were not able to do it. Actually, Altai is in Russia. It was being done there because of the indigenous people of Altai and their connection to the mountains that connect, in Russia, the back of the mountains. I forget the names of the
Pamirs.
The Pamirs. Afghanistan. These are famous mountains for the spiritual stories about this being the Garden of Eden, and this is where it came out of. And the people of Altai are the indigenous people. So the connection was for the indigenous people of Afghanistan to be rejuvenated and helped by the indigenous people of Altai. It was an attempt to bring that mystical quality that everybody needs to shake off the sort of the old ideas and believe that there has to be new thinking and that will bring us to a new place. There were lots of complications that stopped it from happening. I think the United States could use this kind of mystical conference, sort of a national mystical conference, and incorporating what we were trying to bring to it through the HARE connection. That was deeply appreciated. That was the point. There were enough people who recognized that the power that was represented by HARE, and especially its music, could be a part of the healing process. And that we could bring that, the idea of the fulfillment of helping the Afghans was a continuation of what we'd started with HARE. And Let the Sunshine would have been the finale song of the conference, letting the pain and the sadness, let go of it, and let the sunshine to do the healing. And that was the idea.
There's a couple of things that come to mind. Kind of the Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa. I've got a mainstream kind of understanding that was very effective because it was about forgiving. It was about confessing or forgiving a lot of the atrocities there. And alternately, it reminds me a lot of what I admired of Marianne Williamson's presidential campaign in 2020, where she really talked about the soul of America and the need
Mhm.
for a spiritual reckoning.
Right.
And your stories, which I can't wait for book two, like I told you, because I believe you'll be, really telling the mystical doors that you went through, the wisdom and the lessons you got from those experiences, because not everybody's open to that. That's a little woo woo for a lot of people. Some people might
No,
turn off
no.
right here. But I got to tell you, I can't wait to hear, because you can't live too long. Here's a little soapbox. If people would just pay attention to the
No.
coincidences they see in their own lives
Mhm.
Yeah.
and to the
Oh, yeah.
coincidences that
Right.
so many other people report, and the stories people tell when they have flatlined and died and come back about what they experienced, I am beyond persuaded that there are only reasons to be cheerful. We transition into quote unquote death. We see all of our past loved ones, or we are instantly filled with the knowledge, painlessly, oh, there was never anything to fear.
Yeah.
It's all one thing. It's all me. It's all us, this infinite field of spirit or love. And yet this is an arena where some really intense adventures happen. I
Mhm.
call them adventures just to be a little lighthearted and be able to, face them and walk into them. What are your thoughts about all of the above?
Well, one thing I'd like to say right away about it is that you're so right about the difficulty, especially of helping people who are really committed to the fact side of things, to the point where they actually think that even mentioning the word mystical is literally like a bomb going off. We ended up doing some research into the whole 60s movement and discovered that even though we were aware that the CIA had something to do with the acid and things like that, we didn't have a clear enough idea of the level, as you said, to which the CIA and the intelligence world were literally so integrated into things that it was impossible practically for anything to happen of its own volition. It explained to us why the power of the hair movement was allowed to happen was because it was apparently a decision to basically get out of Vietnam. That obviously had been made. So this movement somehow was given license, it was given entree into a feeling that it was being far more effective than it may have actually been. But something real did come out of it. And that they might not have cared about, but we really did care about. But one of the stories that we stumbled onto in our research in all of this was a story about a man named Robert Moss. Robert Moss is a very interesting guy. He'll be interesting to a lot of people who think that facts only matter and the dream world is for New Agers. Robert Moss was a high-level intelligence operative, very involved at the time when Brzezinski was very effective. He was using Robert Moss's propaganda to push some of his agendas. And he continued his work until 1987. Ironically, at the same year we finally left the Afghan story to move into screenwriting, Robert Moss decided to move into dream work. Robert Moss became one of the highest level dream gurus in the country. Now, why would a man like Robert Moss go from intelligence work? And remember, we're dealing with MK Ultra and all kinds of spooky
Remember Margaret Thatcher. He wrote Margaret Thatcher's Iron Lady speech.
Yeah,
That's how into the whole thing he was.
And he was very close to high level British intelligence, let's put it that way. And super involved in the propaganda campaign.
So he's now a dream guru.
Now, and this was at a level where he goes to Esalen and all the high level places. We did papers on it. We tried to warn these people in the community. You have got someone who on his website, there is not one word about him being an operative for the intelligence world. Anybody who was doing, and he would do dream work where he'd be co-dreaming. Now, you remember the movie Inception with Leonardo DiCaprio? Remember what they were doing with dreams?
Vividly.
This is the kind of stuff that comes out of MK Ultra, or comes out of this is actually military research, okay, and remote viewing and things like that. And this is the kind of person who opens up a dream website and a dream coach, right? And the people who are signing up with him have no idea, unless they do deep research themselves, what his background is. You don't think that this man is not planting things in people's minds?
See,
with
this is all
work?
part of the
Oh my
psychological
God.
warfare aspect
Yeah.
of this. The
Yeah.
concept of remote viewing was mentioned, dream workshops, things like that. People go, oh, that's woo-woo stuff.
Yeah,
that's
right.
that's mystical. Oh, we don't want that in our factual account of what actually happened. Okay.
Mhm.
And that's all part of the wall that's built
Yeah.
to keep you from understanding what's really going on. I mean, there's still a lot of Catholics in the United States and around the world who go to Mass every Sunday and believe in the consecration of the Eucharist, the conversion of that you are actually consuming the body of Christ. Is it literal or is it mythological? Is it mystical? That's something that everyone has to decide for themselves. But the fact is that there is a mystical aspect to life itself, birth and death, and everything that happens in between can be viewed as a mystical experience. It's also a factual experience.
And you have to marry the
Right.
two to create the narrative. And
Right.
if you have a chronology, which is the reality and the actual time that things happen and the facts behind them, but then you have a mythical view of that reality, it is a
Right.
totally different way of seeing it.
Mhm.
So when you marry the two, that's how you actually create an authentic narrative. And yes, you can manipulate the chronology in order to create the narrative. And you can manipulate the narrative, the mythology, to help create that narrative too. But there is a point at which it's still authentic, but there's a point at which it stretches too far. And that's what I'd say about their narrative right now, is literally they are throwing away facts and putting whatever facts they want in it, and then
Right.
building their narrative
Well,
on that.
you remember the old joke they used to tell many, many years ago? The little boy goes to his mother and says, "Mommy, where do we come from?"
Yeah, right.
And she sits him down and she gives him an in-depth analysis of the way things happen, the birds and the bees and everything else. He says, "That's all very interesting, but my buddy Joey, he said he came from Philadelphia."
Yeah, right.
So there's different ways of looking at these facts.
But but this is the most important point, though, I make to you about the dissing of the mystical. Okay, my point is about what Robert Moss represents. Okay, they take it very seriously. They control it in ways that people don't understand.
And the fact is, we're living in an era of transhumanism.
They're moving, trying to move it, yeah.
Merging computer technology to human beings through technology.
Yeah.
Being able to move things by simply thinking about them and not doing them physically.
Yeah.
So I mean, we certainly, if there's not a mystical aspect to that, I don't know what there could possibly be.
They sell that on the tech, the wearables that'll know what you want to type before you type it. Whitney Webb is reporting a lot about this.
Right, exactly. So these things are now, but my opinion is what they're doing is trying to give you a mechanical version of what you can already do if you open up to it. Why do you need transhumanism to do what you can already do, to reclaim what you completely lost at a time when nobody really gave you the right information to understand what it was? Yes, there are some difficult levels of information that you may have to consider. And in fact, you don't have to take all of it in order to accept the idea that you don't know everything. And some of the things you know may really have been pure propaganda. It's not your fault, though. That's the thing. People get framed and then they feel possessive and they have to defend it.
Exactly.
Now, there are people, and this I think has to be considered, there are people who made decisions based on really bad information and now feel guilty. And so for them, it may be far more difficult to accept that.
A very good example as it applies to Afghanistan was our experience with Chuck Cogan.
Yeah.
Who was the chief of the Near East division of the CIA from 1979 to 1984. In the 1980s, early 1980s, the Reagan mantra and the Carter mantra was all about the Soviet Union pursuing a goal of capturing the oil in the Middle East and creating enormous problems for us, okay? So Chuck Hogan showed up at an event that we did it across the street from Harvard in 2009 when our book came out, Invisible History. Chuck Hogan is the second man up to the microphone after we finished speaking at this event. and he's at Harvard now. He's a doctor of philosophy, and he says, I agree with your assessment of the Soviets not wanting to go into Afghanistan and not wanting to make it a long-term project. He said, I've read the papers, I've read what they said at the Politburo. He said, but this whole business about Brzezinski intentionally luring them in, I just don't get that, because I was the chief of that operation for 5 years, and I just never got a whiff of anything about intentionally luring the Soviets into their own doom. So anyway, we go back in 2015, and we just wanted to make sure we got, his side of the story complete. So we went back, and he invited us into his home in Harvard Square, and we went in with the cameraman. We got about 5 minutes into the interview. He says, "Can I tell you something about Brzezinski?" And I said, "Yeah, of course." He said, I never bought into that whole article where he supposedly admitted that the interview with him where he admitted that he had intentionally lured them in. And he said he came up here to Harvard. He said, I finally got to meet him. So I went up to him and I told him that I didn't believe it. And he said, well, you should believe it because it's true. I did intentionally lure them in. He said, what you were doing over at Langley was very different from what we were doing at the White House. Yeah. And so Chuck Hogan, who's now in his mid-80s, is saying, whoa. Yeah. He said, I should have been able to know about all of those things. Okay. He said, I had regular meetings with the people at the White House. I had all these different things. He said,
how did he get away with it?
How did Brzezinski do that?
But he didn't know the level of secrecy that
And that's
Brzezinski
what
was
he said.
operating
He
under.
said, I was not aware of the high level politics that were going on. Yeah. And that's the way he referred to it.
That's
the high level politics that were going on in secret behind the scenes of the CIA's chief executive officers. Right. The facts are very much different than we have been led to believe.
Remember, the reason that they can get away with no facts is because they're not being offered, people are not being offered a new narrative. That's what we're trying to do. We're saying we've got enough facts to know what really happened. Mm-hmm. We're okay with that. That's over. We know now where empire leads. It leads to insanity. Okay. That means we have to create a new idea about how we can coexist that recognizes that we have lived through the use of force at a level where we can see to use force for good. Okay. Always it turns into evil. It's just that simple. Eventually, the use of force, period, results in evil being done. All right. And it isn't about people being evil. It's about the power people are given under circumstances where and that's the mystical power. It's like the people give the leadership the mystical power to use it as they see fit. All right. And we're learning now we can't have leadership alone with all that power. In fact, it makes them ill, makes them sick. And this is what we've lived through. The Anunnaki tablets from the Sumerians say things that are very much like the kind of leadership we have today, the attitude that they have towards humans today, that we are literally their pawns, that they should be able to pretty much lead us in whatever way they decide. So we've got an experience now, and we now have to digest it. If you don't have some level of reality of what happened, it's hard to move on and literally think a new thought. And that's part of the maturing process. Yeah. I liken it, I call it, we're living through the revenge and retribution cycle, and it's just gone crazy. We actually got a letter from a man who claimed he was a heretic. We'd written an article about why we needed to move beyond that, and the JFK assassination was our focus. The idea of assassinating JFK as a solution to revenge and retribution. And we're saying it's time for this to end, okay? And this man wrote and said, I'm a heretic. And he brought back things that went back 1,000 years to justify the slaughter of JFK. So we've got to accept the fact that this is a real phenomena in people, and they actually are living and breathing it, that they are creating the next generation of victims who are going to embrace revenge and retribution. When does it get ended?
You're reminding me of the bell curve as a model for humanity. The vast majority just waddle through and just muddle through and just go along. Mm-hmm. And on the fringes, if really good people like a Kennedy rises up can start motivating and moving the big fat center toward nice things and improvements, or we're so bombarded and brainwashed by full spectrum domination of media and education and chemicals that the really evil psychopaths have embedded in us a narrative and symbology that's just really destructive, and it's suicidal and all these other things. And the best we can do is talk to humanity full spectrum and know that there's a percentage that are going to get grabbed by the factual analysis of the chronology of the literal events. There are others who are going to get grabbed by, wow, there's energetic forces and spiritual forces that are at work. Because I want to speak, I want to use whatever color reaches people. I want to use whatever language, speaks, because we just have to get more of the big, fat, lazy middle. We don't need 50%. We don't even need, I don't think we need 25%. I think the movements of history show that if you get 5%, you can pull the big fat human herd into a nicer direction instead of following evil speakers into our own destruction and off the edge of a cliff. That's my hope. That's what,
Right.
Well, I think we can too.
I think we can.
I think we're all here because we think something can be done and to make things better.
Exactly.
And, and they need to get better.